Hook. The emergency room went dead quiet the moment Dr. Marcus Vale pointed his finger at her. "You don't belong here," he said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Someone like you never did." Elena Voss didn't flinch. She stood in her worn scrubs with a clipboard pressed against her chest, blood still drying on her sleeve from the last patient she'd worked on for 40 minutes straight. She looked at him, said nothing. What Marcus Vale didn't know, what nobody in that hospital knew, was that the woman he was humiliating in front of his staff had once kept 3 special operations soldiers alive in a collapsed forward operating base with nothing but field supplies in her own 2 hands. The military had been looking for her for 2 years, and they were about to find her. If this story already has you locked in, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The shift started the way bad nights usually did, quietly. Elena Voss clocked in at 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes before her scheduled start, because she always clocked in early. Not for recognition, not because anyone asked her to. She did it because Ravenwood Medical Center's trauma bay ran short-staffed on weekday evenings, and she knew that, and that knowledge sat in her chest the way most things did. Heavy, practical, unavoidable. She hung her coat on the hook in the staff locker room and stood for a moment looking at her reflection in the narrow strip of mirror above the sink. 34 years old. Brown hair pulled back tight. A small scar near her left temple that she'd stopped noticing years ago. She looked exactly like what Marcus Vale called her. Ordinary. She tied her hair back, picked up her badge, and went to work. The trauma bay at Ravenwood wasn't impressive by large hospital standards. It was a Level 2 facility in a mid-sized stretch of Denver's northeast corridor, the kind of hospital that handled car accidents and construction injuries and the occasional cardiac arrest. Competent work, necessary work, but nothing that made the papers. The staff was a mix of experienced lifers and rotating residents who were always either exhausted or overconfident. Elena had been there 3 years. She knew every squeaky wheel on every crash cart. She knew which monitors threw false alarms and which attending physicians actually listened during handoffs. She kept her head down. She did her job. People either didn't notice her or didn't bother. That was the point. She picked up her first patient at 7:02 p.m., a 61-year-old man named Gerald, who'd been brought in after a fall from a ladder at his house. His daughter was in the waiting room. Elena introduced herself, took his vitals, noted the way he was holding his right arm and the mild disorientation in his responses, and flagged the attending on duty with her concern about a possible concussion compounding a suspected hairline fracture. The attending, a tall resident named Dr. Patel, who had the specific energy of someone 2 hours into a 12-hour shift, looked at her flag and nodded. "Good catch." Elena didn't say anything. She updated the chart and moved on. By 8:15, she had managed 4 patients, assisted in a chest compression rotation, and restocked the supply cart in Bay 3 that someone had left half empty from the previous shift. She was writing up notes on patient 2 when she heard his voice at the nursing station. Marcus Vale didn't enter rooms. He arrived in them. He was 52, broad-shouldered in the specific way of men who had once been athletic and never stopped reminding people of it, with silver hair swept back from a face that had learned early how to project authority. He was Ravenwood's chief of surgical services, a position he'd held for 11 years and intended to hold until retirement, and the way he moved through the hospital made clear he considered the building his by right of occupation. Staff adjusted around him the way water adjusts around a boat. Elena had noticed, in her 3 years at Ravenwood, that Marcus Vale only appeared in the trauma bay during evening shifts when he wanted something or when he was unhappy about something. Tonight, she suspected it was both. She kept writing. "Voss?" She looked up. I was standing 6 feet away with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her with the expression he reserved for administrative problems. A flat, performative patience, like someone waiting for a slow computer to load. "Dr. Vale, I need you to walk me through what happened in Bay 7 at 6:30. Bay 7. Elena set down her pen. There was no 6:30 admission to Bay 7. The bay was empty from 5 p.m. until I pulled Gerald Marsh in at 7:02. "That's not what I'm hearing." She waited. "What are you hearing?" He pulled a tablet from under his arm and held it toward her, not close enough for her to read it clearly, just close enough to make the point that he was holding something she was supposed to care about. There's a notation in the system from the charge nurse indicating a medication discrepancy flagged in Bay 7 at 1832. Your badge was scanned at the Bay 7 cart at 1829. Elena thought back. She had gone to Bay 7 before her shift technically started, because she'd known the cart was low, and she'd wanted to check before the rush hit. She had scanned in, taken a full inventory, and found that someone from the previous shift had logged 2 doses of a sedative as administered that matched neither the patient volume nor the patient records from that window. She had flagged it, in writing, to the charge nurse. I flagged that discrepancy, she said. I documented it. I brought it to Dana Reyes before my shift started. Dana says she has no record of that conversation. The words landed with the precise weight Marcus Vale intended. Not loud enough to be a scene yet, but loud enough to be heard. A resident near the printer had gone still. The unit clerk at the desk had stopped typing. Elena kept her voice level. Then Dana is mistaken. I spoke to her at 6:41. She was standing at the North Corridor junction. Marcus tilted his head, the way someone tilts their head when they've already decided not to believe you. Ms. Voss, this is the 3rd documentation concern raised about your charting in the past 4 months. One of those was a system error that IT confirmed. The second was a notation format issue that I corrected within the hour. And the third is this one, which I'm telling you right now is not accurate. He looked at her for a long moment. The trauma bay had the specific silence of a room where people are pretending not to listen. You know what I think? Marcus said. He wasn't looking at the tablet anymore. He was looking at her, and there was something in it that was less about the medication log and more about something older, something he'd decided about her long before tonight. I think you've been in this department long enough to develop some habits that aren't serving the patients or the staff. I think you've gotten comfortable, and I think comfort is a problem in trauma care. Elena said, I agree that comfort is a problem in trauma care. I don't think that's what's happening here. I'm not asking for your opinion on what's happening. I know. She picked her pen back up. I'm giving it anyway. Something shifted in his face. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional drop in the performative patience. He wasn't used to being answered. Not like that. Not flatly, without apology or deference, from someone who looked the way she looked and wore the badge she wore. I want a formal response on my desk by 8 a.m., he said, regarding the Bay 7 discrepancy in your account of the interaction with Dana Reyes. I'll have it to you by 7. He stared at her, then he turned and left. The resident near the printer exhaled. The unit clerk started typing again. Elena looked down at her notes and finished her sentence. The problem with Marcus Vale was not that he was incompetent. He wasn't. He was a skilled surgeon with a genuine record. There were outcomes under his knife that other surgeons in the city would have called losses. The problem was that his competence had calcified over the years into the belief that competence made him the final word on everything: process, personnel, priority. He had stopped listening before he'd ever learned to listen well. And the hospital had accommodated that because his surgical numbers were good and his donor relationships were better, and those two things, in an institution that needed both, could forgive a lot. Elena had understood this within her first month at Ravenwood. She had filed it under known conditions, the way she filed most things, accurately, without drama, and with a clear-eyed assessment of what it meant for how she operated. What it meant was, stay small, document everything. Don't volunteer information that requires justification. Do the work. She had done that for 3 years. It had worked until tonight, and the reason it had stopped working tonight was not the medication log. She was almost certain the medication log was clean. Her documentation was thorough. Dana Reyes knew it, and Marcus Vale would find nothing when he went looking. The reason it had stopped working tonight was something else, something she'd felt shifting in the past few weeks like a pressure change before weather. Marcus was building something. She didn't know why, and she didn't know what, but she recognized the pattern of a person who had decided someone needed to go and was now collecting reasons. She was halfway through patient 4's intake notes when Dana Reyes appeared beside her. Dana was the charge nurse, 47, brisk, efficient, someone Elena had respected and been professionally cordial with for 3 years without ever becoming close to. She had the look of a person who had just had an uncomfortable conversation and was now having another one on purpose. Elena, she said, keeping her voice low. About earlier. You told him you didn't remember. A pause. He caught me off guard. I didn't think… Dana. Elena turned to look at her. You know what I flagged and when I flagged it. You initialed the verbal acknowledgement. That's in the log. The log is… Dana stopped, pressed her lips together. Marcus is going to make this difficult. I know. He's going to make it difficult for me too if I know, Elena said again. She looked at Dana for a moment, at the exhaustion in her face and the specific shape of a person trying to calculate the least painful path through something. Elena understood it. She didn't resent it. You should do what you need to do. Dana looked at her with something that might have been relief or might have been guilt. The two looked almost identical in people who didn't want to examine the difference. Then she walked away. Elena turned back to her notes. At 9:20 p.m., Marcus Vale returned to the trauma bay. This time he brought someone with him. Harriet Stowe, Ravenwood's director of nursing operations, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the general energy of someone who had been dragged here from somewhere she'd rather be. Elena watched them approach from the periphery of her vision and kept writing. Ms. Voss, Harriet said, can you step away for a moment? Elena capped her pen and stepped away. They took her to the small staff consultation room off the main corridor, the one with the round table, and the chairs that didn't match, and the motivational poster on the wall that someone had partially defaced with a permanent marker in what appeared to be a moment of peak shift fatigue honesty. Marcus stood near the wall. Harriet sat down across from Elena. Neither of them offered Elena a chair, so she stood, which suited her. We've been reviewing the Bay 7 documentation, Harriet said. I expected you would be. There are some inconsistencies that concern us. The inconsistencies are from the previous shift's charting. My documentation is accurate. Harriet glanced at Marcus. It was a small glance, half a second, but Elena caught it. Ms. Voss, Marcus said, how long have you been in trauma nursing? 6 years, across 3 facilities. And before nursing, you were, what, a military medic? The word landed differently than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. It was hard to tell with Marcus Vale, who was skilled at packaging condescension as curiosity. Field medical technician, she said. Army, 4 years. Right. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. Look, that's a different environment, a different standard. The protocols here are… I'm current on all Ravenwood protocols, she said. I've completed every required competency and every optional one I've been able to access. I'm also current on ACLS, TNCC, and ENPC, which are not required for my position. A brief silence. The issue, Harriet said carefully, isn't your certifications. Then what is the issue? Marcus said, the issue is judgment. Elena looked at him. Whose? The temperature in the room dropped about 2 degrees. Yours, he said, flatly. The way you interact with the team, the way you handle escalations. There's a pattern, Ms. Voss. A pattern of acting outside your scope, inserting yourself into clinical decisions that aren't yours to make, and then, when things go sideways, deflecting accountability onto other staff members. He paused. Dana Reyes has been with this hospital for 16 years. She is not someone who makes errors in recall. Elena said, she initialed the acknowledgement. She says she didn't. It's in the log. Marcus leaned forward slightly. I'm going to be direct with you. This department doesn't work when staff members undermine each other. It doesn't work when someone consistently positions themselves as above the team dynamic. And frankly, he paused again, and in that pause was the thing Elena had been waiting for, the thing beneath the documentation complaint and the protocol language. Frankly, this was probably never the right fit. This is a high-pressure, high-visibility department, and some people do better in… Say it, Elena said. He blinked. Whatever you're about to say, she said. Her voice was quiet. Not angry. Quieter than angry. Quieter than almost anything. Say it clearly. He stared at her. Then he said, you're being placed on administrative suspension pending a full review of the Bay 7 incident and a broader assessment of your performance in this department, effective tonight. The room was very still. I did my job, Elena said. Nothing more. You can collect your things. She looked at him for a long moment, then at Harriet, who was studying the table. Then back at Marcus, who met her gaze with the settled expression of a man who had done this before and found it went more smoothly when the other person understood the power structure. Elena understood a great many things about the power structure. She had operated inside some of the most extreme power structures on Earth, in conditions Marcus Vale couldn't navigate with a map and a translator. She had taken orders from men who could end careers with a word, and she had followed those orders precisely. And she had also, in specific moments that remained classified, made decisions that contradicted those orders because she had assessed the field and made the call and been right. She understood power. She had simply, deliberately, chosen not to use most of hers. She nodded once. I'll need 15 minutes to complete the handoff documentation for my current patients. That's, Harriet started. My patients need continuity of care. 15 minutes. Marcus made a slight gesture that might have been concession or might have been dismissal. Elena turned and walked out. She spent the 15 minutes doing what she said she'd do. Thorough handoff notes for all 4 patients, flagging the specific concerns she had about Gerald Marsh's response pattern and the potential concussion, updating the chart on patient 3, whose medication timing would need to be tracked past midnight. She did it cleanly, completely, without rushing, and when she was done, she found the resident Dr. Patel and walked him through each patient in person. You're leaving? Patel asked. For now. He looked at her with the expression of someone who understood more than he was going to say in this hallway. The Gerald Marsh concussion flag. That's important. It is. Watch for a delayed presentation. He presented mild, but his response times were inconsistent. If he spikes a headache above a 4 in the next 2 hours, push for imaging. Patel nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. Elena got her coat. She stood for a moment at the locker room door, not thinking about Marcus Vale or the suspension or the document she'd have to file with HR in the morning. She was thinking about Gerald Marsh's daughter in the waiting room. She was thinking about whether Patel would catch it if the concussion presented atypically. She pushed the door open and walked down the corridor toward the exit. She was 20 feet from the ambulance bay doors when they opened. Not the regular doors. The trauma bay doors. The wide ones on the east side that they used for critical incoming. They swung open hard, both of them, slammed back against the stops, and a gurney came through at a speed that meant the EMTs were running. But these weren't EMTs. The men pushing the gurney were in tactical gear, stripped of identifying patches, armored vests still on, one of them with blood on the front of his shirt that wasn't his. 2 more followed immediately behind, one supporting another who was moving under his own power but barely. A 5th man came through last, and he stopped inside the doors and scanned the trauma bay with the fast, total attention of someone who spent his professional life assessing environments for threat. And behind them, behind all of them, came the dog. A Belgian Malinois, maybe 4 years old, lean and dark-muzzled and wearing a tactical harness that had seen recent action. The dog was moving under his own control, no handler guiding him, tracking close to the gurney. His ears were up. He was working. The trauma bay erupted. The night attending, a Dr. Summerfield who'd come on at 9, was already moving toward the gurney, calling for a crash cart, calling for respiratory. Nurses converged. The unit clerk was on the phone. Elena had stopped walking. She was standing in the corridor, 20 feet from the exit, coat in her hand. The dog's head swung toward her. He stopped, his whole body stilled in the way of an animal that has just recognized something it was trained to recognize. Not a smell, not a sound, but a presence. His ears went from forward to flat, not threat flat, but the specific softening of a working animal that has found what it was looking for. He crossed the room toward her. Not fast. Purposefully. Elena didn't move. The Malinois stopped in front of her and sat, looked up at her. And then, against his training and his current deployment, he leaned his head against her leg. The 5th man, the one who had scanned the room, had followed the dog. I was standing 3 feet away now, watching her. He was maybe 45, dark-haired, with the kind of face that didn't show much but showed everything in what it chose not to show. There was a question forming in it. That dog has never done that, he said. Not for anyone. Elena looked down at the Malinois. She put her hand on his head, briefly, steadily, the way someone touches something they recognize. He did it for me, she said. From the trauma bay, Summerfield's voice cut through the noise. Someone get me a second line. and I need a trauma surgeon now. The man in front of Elena said, "Are you staff here?" She looked up. "Not at the moment." He stared at her, his jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means I was walking out when you walked in." He looked at the dog. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, like a man revising a calculation. "I need a name," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the tactical gear, at the men through the trauma bay doors where Summerfield was already losing control of the situation. She could hear it in the pitch of the voices, the specific escalating uncertainty of a team trying to manage something beyond their usual parameters. She looked at the dog. "Elena Voss," she said. The man went very still. The name had done something to him. She watched it happen. The precise, controlled response of someone trained not to react visibly, who was, in this specific moment, reacting visibly. "Voss?" he repeated. "Yes." He reached into his vest and pulled out a secure phone, swiped it open, and turned it so she could see the screen. There was a file on it, a photograph, older, taken. Maybe 5 years ago, different hair, different clothes. She was wearing desert tan in the photo and standing in front of a vehicle she recognized as a Humvee that had been modified for medical extraction work. But it was her, unmistakably her. Beneath the photograph was a classification header she wasn't going to read aloud in a hospital corridor. And beneath that, in clean bureaucratic font, status, locate, and confirm. From the trauma bay, something crashed, a tray or a cart, or both. And then Summerfield's voice, strained and precise, "He's crashing. I need someone who knows blast trauma." The man looked at her. Elena was already moving. Part 2. She didn't run. Running in a trauma bay was how people got hurt, how carts got clipped and lines got pulled, and the already fragile chain of someone's survival got one more weak link added to it. Elena walked fast, the specific fast of someone who had learned the difference between urgency and panic and had drilled that difference into her body until it was automatic. The Malinois fell into step beside her without being told. The man in tactical gear was a half step behind. She could hear him, not trying to stop her now, just following, which told her something about how he was reading the situation and what he'd decided she was. She pushed through the trauma bay doors. The room was loud with the wrong kind of noise. Not the productive noise of a team working well under pressure, but the fractured noise of people working hard in slightly different directions, each competent in isolation and collectively losing ground. Dr. Summerfield was at the head of the gurney, mask on, calling for things in a voice that had the particular strained quality of someone maintaining command presence through willpower rather than confidence. 2 nurses Elena recognized were managing lines. A respiratory tech was setting up airway equipment that, from where she stood, was the wrong configuration for the injury pattern she was already reading from across the room. The man on the gurney was late 30s, powerfully built, in the stripped remains of tactical gear that someone had cut away en route. The visible wounds told a partial story. Primary blast exposure, left lateral. The shrapnel pattern across his left side was consistent with a close-range detonation, partial concealment, wrong angle. There was a chest seal already applied, left side, which was correct, but the breath sounds she could hear from 6 feet away were wrong in a way that meant the seal wasn't doing what they needed it to do. "Tension's building," she said. Not to anyone in particular. To the room. Summerfield looked up. His eyes went to her coat, her badge, the badge that was technically suspended, and then to the man in tactical gear who had come through the doors behind her, and then back to her with the fast calculation of someone weighing options in real time. "Voss?" he said. It wasn't an endorsement. It was a question. "The chest seal is seated wrong," she said, moving to the left side of the gurney. "He's building pressure on the right. You've got a tension pneumo developing. We've got a seal. The seal is on the entry side." She was already at the gurney, gloves on. She'd taken them from the cart without breaking stride, a move so automatic she hadn't registered doing it. The blast pushed debris inward and right. "There's a secondary pocket you're not venting." Summerfield stared at her for exactly 1 second. Then, "Show me." She showed him. Her hands moved through the assessment with the particular efficiency of someone for whom this was not a clinical scenario, but a familiar problem with a known solution set. She had seen this specific injury pattern 3 times, two of which had survived and one of which had not, and the one that had not survived had died because of a 40-second delay on exactly this call. She was not going to have a 40-second delay. Needle decompression, right side, second intercostal, midclavicular, she said. Now, before we do anything else. His pressure is, I know what his pressure is. It's going to get worse, not better, until we vent the right side. Somebody tell me what his SATs were on scene. One of the men in tactical gear, not the one who'd followed her in, a younger one near the door, said, 72 on scene, 81 when we loaded. How long in transport? 11 minutes. She did the math that wasn't really math, just accumulated pattern recognition, and said to Summerfield, we have maybe 4 minutes before this becomes unrecoverable. I need you to make a call. Summerfield looked at her. He was a decent physician. She knew that from 3 years of working adjacent to him. But he was working at the edge of his training, and he knew it, and he was smart enough to know that the person across the gurney from him was not. Do it, he said. She did it. The room recalibrated around her, not because anyone announced anything or made a formal handoff. It happened the way authority sometimes shifts in crisis situations, through demonstrated knowledge rather than stated hierarchy. People began orienting toward her. Instruments appeared at her request before she finished asking. The respiratory tech, a sharp young woman named Bex, who Elena had always quietly respected, corrected the airway setup without being told twice. The man on the gurney, she didn't know his name yet, didn't need it yet, had his SATs climbing within 90 seconds of the decompression. Not to normal, not close to normal, but climbing, which meant the pressure was releasing, which meant she'd been right, which meant he had more time than he'd had 30 seconds ago. Secondary injuries, she said. Walk me through what you saw on scene. The man in tactical gear, the one who'd followed her in, the one who'd shown her the phone, had come to stand at the edge of the trauma bay. Not interfering. Watching with the focused attention of someone who was gathering information and would act on it later. His name, she would learn in the next 10 minutes, was Commander Dax Holt. She already suspected something like that. He had that specific quality of stillness that senior military personnel developed, the kind that looked like patience and was actually constant assessment. IED, partial shield, said one of the other men. Stocky, 30s, a cut above his left eye that nobody had touched yet. He took the left side, crawled maybe 30 meters before we reached him, conscious on scene, kept trying to give us his blood type. Did he lose consciousness in transport? Once. Came back in about 40 seconds. Pupils on scene? Equal. Reactive. She nodded, filed it, moved to the next problem. The left side injuries were extensive but survivable if managed in sequence. She was building the sequence in her head as she worked, the same way she'd always built sequences, in a kind of rapid layering that felt less like thinking and more like reading something already written. The shrapnel in his left lateral chest wall was going to need imaging before anyone went near it surgically. The rib fractures, she could feel at least 3 on palpation, were significant but not the immediate threat. The bleed she was most worried about was internal, not the surface wounds. His abdomen was rigid in a way that she cataloged and flagged and moved past, because the rigidity meant it was already a problem and the chest was the more immediate one. I need a fast exam, she told Bex. Right now while we stabilize the chest, and I need someone to tell the OR to clear a room. Summerfield said from the other side of the gurney. Voss. Who authorized? You did, she said, 4 minutes ago, and you were right to. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man caught between institutional instinct and the evidence of his own eyes, which was one of the harder places to be. She didn't wait for him to resolve it. The patient didn't have time for that resolution. Fast exam, she said again. Or notification. Someone needs to reach vascular because I think we've got a splenic issue developing. Bex was already moving. Dax Holt had not moved from his position at the edge of the room, but he pulled out his secure phone and made a call that she couldn't hear over the noise of the bay. Whatever he said was short. He listened for a moment. His expression didn't change, which told her that whatever he'd heard was confirming something he'd already suspected. It was 47 minutes before the patient, whose name she learned was Staff Sergeant Rourke Callum, 36, Special Operations, currently officially not present in any database that Ravenwood's intake system could access, was stable enough to move toward the OR. 47 minutes in which Elena did not stop moving, did not stop thinking, did not stop managing the room with the particular combination of precision and improvisation that was, she had always known, her actual skill set. Not the charting, not the shift handoffs, not the competency certification she maintained like a person who needed to prove something to themselves on a regular schedule. This. The OR team took Callum at 10:34 p.m. Elena stepped back from the gurney and stood in the space left behind and for a moment simply breathed. Her hands were shaking. Not badly. A fine tremor, the kind that came from sustained, controlled effort releasing all at once. She pressed them flat against her thighs and it stopped. The trauma bay was reorganizing around the absence of the crisis. People were moving equipment, restocking, writing things down. Bex caught Elena's eye across the room and gave her a single nod. Not effusive, not performed, just the specific acknowledgement of one competent person to another. Elena nodded back. Voss? She turned. Dax Holt was standing 3 feet away. He had waited. She appreciated that more than she was going to say. He's going to make it, she said. It wasn't a question. Because of you. Because the team responded well once they had a direction. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite skepticism and wasn't quite admiration. More like recalibration. The same recalibration she'd seen in his face in the corridor, but deeper now, more settled. I need you to come with me. I'm not going anywhere until I know the OR team has everything they need. That'll be a while. Then we have a while. He almost smiled. She couldn't be certain. You haven't changed. She looked at him. You don't know me. No, he said. But I know your file, which is approximately 300 pages long and classified at a level that gives most people in my office a headache to access. He paused. You pulled a man out of a burning vehicle with a compound fracture of your own left radius, in Kandahar, in 2019. She said nothing. You didn't report the fracture until the man was stable and extracted. It was a hairline, she said, at the time. It wasn't. She looked at the OR doors. Is there something you need from me tonight, Commander? Or are we going to stand here while you read from a file I lived? He said, we need to talk about why you're working as a floor nurse at a level 2 trauma center in Denver under your own name with your service record buried so deep we couldn't pull it from standard inquiry. That's not a question. It is. It just doesn't have a question mark. She turned to face him fully. I was done, she said. I left. People are allowed to leave. People are, he said. But you specifically signed a transition agreement that included, I know what I signed. Then you know that done isn't quite the word. The Malinois had settled near the wall, at rest, but not fully off duty, ears tracking the room. Elena looked at him for a moment. His name was Kratos. She had learned from one of the other men earlier, and he had been on 4 deployments and was trained for medical detection work, among other things, and had, according to his handler, the stocky one with the cut above his eye, whose name was Sergeant First Class Aaron Bryce, never reacted to a civilian the way he'd reacted to Elena. She looked back at Holt. What happened on your op? He considered how much to answer. Compromised extraction route. Secondary device. How many casualties? Callum is the only critical. 2 others walking wounded. 1 KIA. He said the last part the way military personnel said that. Factually, with the specific flatness of people who had learned that flatness was the only way to keep saying it. We came here because it was closest and because our field surgeon was the KIA. Something moved through her that she didn't name. I'm sorry, she said. His name was Captain Denny Marsh. He paused. He talked about you, not by name, but the way he described his instructor in advanced trauma management at Bragg in 2018, he stopped. That was you. She had known a Denny Marsh. Not well. He'd come through a 3-week intensive she'd run as part of a cross-unit training program, quiet kid, serious, asked good questions. She'd written a commendation for him at the end of the session. She absorbed this quietly. She didn't let it land on her face because that was a habit too, one of the deep ones. And the grief that was working its way through her chest was going to have to wait. What do you need from me? She said. Right now? A debrief on Callum's status for the official record. We need a qualified medical assessor's account of his condition on arrival and the interventions taken. He held her gaze. Someone at your clearance level. I don't have an active clearance. Voss, You have a very active clearance. You just haven't been using it. She stared at him. That's not... She stopped. She actually didn't know if that was accurate. The transition agreement had been complicated. She had signed things she hadn't fully parsed at the time because she'd been tired and hurt in ways that weren't physical, and she'd wanted out badly enough to stop reading carefully, which was not like her, and which she had spent the subsequent years not thinking about. That's something I need to verify. I can help you verify it. He reached into his vest again, not the phone this time, a folded document in a sealed envelope, and held it out. Or you can read this. She took it, didn't open it. There's something else, he said. Of course there is. The reason we came to Ravenwood specifically wasn't proximity. There are 3 trauma facilities closer to where we were operating tonight. He let that sit for a moment. We came here because someone on my team recognized the hospital name from a flag in a secondary file. A flag that was placed 48 hours ago by a hospital administrator who ran an inquiry through a contractor database looking for background information on a staff nurse. Elena went still. Someone here ran a check on you, Holt said. Not through HR, not through standard reference verification, through a contracted background service that is used primarily by people who want information that standard HR channels won't surface. She thought about Marcus Vale, about the way he'd looked at her in the consultation room, about the word military and the pause before it, and the slight recalibration in his tone that she'd noticed and filed and not fully understood. When? She said. 48 hours ago. The inquiry hit a flag in our system because of your transition agreement. That flag generated an alert. The alert reached my office yesterday morning. He paused. By the time we were wheels up tonight, finding you was already part of the mission. Elena opened the envelope. The document inside was 3 pages. The first page was a formal notification, crisp, official, the kind of language that existed to be legally unambiguous. The second page was a summary of her transition agreement's remaining provisions, several of which she had, in her haste and exhaustion 3 years ago, apparently agreed to that she had not fully understood. The third page was something she had not expected. It was a formal complaint, filed through a military advocacy office. Patient safety concern, Ravenwood Medical Center, filed by a name she didn't recognize, but the details in the complaint described the systematic documentation of staff misconduct, patient care compromises, and the targeted professional destruction of at least 4 nursing staff members over a period of 2 years. The filing date was 6 weeks ago. The person named as the primary subject of the complaint was Marcus Vale. She read the third page twice. Then she looked up at Holt. Someone already filed, she said. Someone already filed. We've been sitting on it pending a supporting investigation. The inquiry that flagged you accelerated our timeline. He watched her face. The person who filed had enough evidence to open a case, but not enough to close one. They were missing a credible medical witness with the standing to evaluate the clinical claims. Someone with an active clearance level. Someone whose testimony can't be dismissed as a disgruntled former employee. She folded the document, held it, thought about Gerald Marsh's daughter in the waiting room. Not the Marsh who died tonight, a different man entirely. A coincidence that felt like something but wasn't. Thought about Dana Reyes's face in the corridor. Thought about the 4 nurses mentioned in the complaint she hadn't been able to read in full detail yet, but whose situation she could partially reconstruct from 2 lines of description. How many people did he do this to? She said. Holt said, that's what the investigation is trying to establish. From down the corridor, the sound of footsteps, quick, deliberate, the specific footstep cadence of someone moving with authority toward a destination. Elena turned. Marcus Vale was coming down the hall. He hadn't been in the trauma bay during the crisis. She didn't know where he'd been. Pulled from somewhere else, informed by someone, summoned by whatever internal network of hospital politics kept him oriented to events on his floor. He was in his coat, badge visible, jaw set, and he was looking at the trauma bay doors with an expression that was doing its best to be concerned administrator and not quite succeeding. He saw Elena. He stopped. She was still holding the envelope. She watched him register it. The military seal, the document visible where she'd refolded it slightly wrong. She watched the recognition in his face, the specific sequence of a man who thought he was 2 steps ahead, discovering he might be 3 steps behind. Ms. Voss, he said, What are you still doing here? You were placed on suspension. She saved one of my men tonight, Holt said. Marcus looked at Holt, at the tactical gear, at the two other operators visible through the bay doors, and at Kratos, who had come to stand beside Elena with the quiet purposefulness of an animal that had made a determination. And you are? Marcus said. Commander Dax Holt, Naval Special Warfare. He didn't extend his hand. And you're Dr. Marcus Vale, Chief of Surgical Services. He let that sit. We've heard about you. The words were simple, neutral in construction, devastating in implication. Marcus's face did something complex and fast. Elena watched it happen. The flash of calculation, the assessment of threat, the decision about which version of himself to present. He landed on the administrator version, the one that had worked in the consultation room 2 hours ago. I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding about Ms. Voss's status tonight. In a crisis situation, of course we want all available. There are some questions, Holt said, that my team is going to need answered about the operational environment here, specifically regarding patient handling protocols and, he paused, staff management practices. The corridor had people in it, nurses, a resident, the unit clerk who'd been at the station when Marcus had come in earlier. All of them were doing what hospital staff did, moving, looking busy, pretending not to listen with the specific intensity of people listening very hard. Marcus looked at Elena, and in that look was the thing beneath all of it. Not the authority, not the administrative performance, not the practiced management of subordinates who didn't push back. Beneath all of that was something simpler, the look of a man who had made a mistake and was now doing the math on it. This isn't the place for this conversation, he said. No, Holt agreed. It's not. He turned to Elena. I'm going to need you available tomorrow morning. Formal debrief, Callum's medical record, and a shh, he glanced at Marcus. Some additional matters. Elena nodded. Marcus said, Ms. Voss is on administrative suspension. She doesn't have standing to participate in any official. Her suspension, Holt said, is a matter we're going to need to discuss as well. He said it simply, without heat, with exactly the weight of a man who held the kind of authority that didn't need volume to land. Marcus went quiet. Elena looked at the envelope in her hands. She thought about 3 years of small rooms and careful silences and the deliberate making small of herself. 3 years of doing the work without the title or the recognition or the space to be what she actually was. And she thought about the moment the bay doors had opened tonight and the way Kratos had crossed the room toward her as if he had always known where she was. She looked up and found Holt watching her with that recalibrating expression again. 7 a.m., she said. 7 a.m., he confirmed. She put the envelope in her coat pocket. She looked at Marcus one more time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who had accurately read a situation and filed it correctly. Good night, Dr. Vale, she said. She turned toward the exit. This time she made it through the doors. Behind her, she heard Holt say something to Marcus in a low, even voice. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She had heard that tone before, in briefing rooms and command posts and field environments where the people doing the talking had every card and the people being talked to were only just beginning to understand what game they were actually playing. She pushed through the ambulance bay doors into the cold Denver night and stood for a moment on the concrete apron with the city spread out in the middle distance and the mountain dark to the west, and the cold moving through her coat like it had somewhere to be. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number, Denver area code. She answered it. Ms. Voss? A woman's voice. Careful. My name is Agent Petra Salvo. I'm with the Office of Inspector General, Department of Defense. I understand you may have received some documentation tonight. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. I may have, she said. Good. Because what's in that envelope is only part of what we have on Marcus Vale. And what we have on Marcus Vale, a brief pause, includes something that involves you directly, something that happened before you left the service. Another pause, shorter. Something you were never told about. The cold moved through her again. What time? Elena said. We're already in the building, Salvo said. We've been here since 9. Part 3. She found them in the small family consultation room on the second floor, the one with the better chairs and the wall-mounted screen that was usually used for difficult conversations with next of kin. Agent Petra Salvo was not what Elena had expected, though Elena was not sure what she'd expected. Salvo was maybe 40, compact, dark-suited, with close-cropped natural hair and the specific quality of stillness that came not from military training, but from years of watching people in rooms and knowing when to speak and when not to. There was a second agent with her, younger, male, laptop open on the table, who introduced himself as Agent Corrigan and then went back to his screen. Holt was already there, sitting in the corner with his arms crossed, watching the door when Elena came through it. "You move fast," she said to Salvo. "We've been moving for 6 weeks," Salvo said. "Tonight just changed the pace." She gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit down, Ms. Voss. There's a lot to cover." Elena sat. She put the envelope on the table but didn't open it. "You said something happened before I left the service, something I wasn't told about." Salvo looked at Corrigan. He turned the laptop so Elena could see the screen. It was a document, internal, formatted in the specific dense layout of a Department of Defense administrative record. She read the header twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. She was. "This is a formal performance review," she said. "Filed under my name." "Filed under your name," Salvo confirmed. "In October 2021, 3 weeks before you submitted your separation paperwork." Elena had submitted her separation paperwork in November 2021. She remembered the date precisely. The 11th, a Thursday, raining. She had sat in an office in Fort Bragg and signed forms for 2 hours while a staff officer who barely looked at her stamped and countersigned and stamped again. She had been 31 years old and exhausted in a way she hadn't had a name for yet. She had wanted to leave. She had left. "I never filed a performance review," she said. "No," Salvo said. "You didn't. Someone filed it for you." She looked at the document. The review described a pattern of insubordination, poor judgment, under pressure, and she had to read this part a third time to believe it. A specific incident in September 2021 in which a training exercise under her supervision had resulted in 2 injuries due to her failure to follow safety protocols. None of it had happened. "There was no September incident," she said. "We know. I ran the September cycle by the book, both cycles. There were no injuries. I have my own documentation." "We know," Salvo said again, more quietly. "Ms. Voss, this review was filed by someone with access to your personnel file and sufficient administrative standing to insert a document into the official record without triggering standard review flags. It was designed to sit dormant, to not affect your separation because it was filed after your review window, but to be discoverable after the fact. If anyone ran a deep background on you post-separation, it would look like I left under a cloud," Elena said. "It would look like you were pushed out for cause, not formally, just the shape of it, the implication." Salvo leaned forward slightly. "Do you know why someone would want that?" Elena's mind was running the timeline, pulling threads. September 2021. She had been running advanced trauma training cycles at Bragg. She had also, in August of that year, filed an internal complaint, not formal, not through official channels, just a documented concern submitted to her commanding officer, about a procurement irregularity she'd noticed in the medical supply chain. Equipment being logged as field deployed that she was near certain had never left the warehouse. The amounts were not enormous. The pattern was. She had filed it. Her CO had told her he'd look into it. She had never heard back. "I filed a supply chain concern in August 2021, she said. Salvo's expression didn't shift, but something in the room did. A slight change in the quality of Corrigan's attention, a fraction of a degree of increased stillness in Holt's corner. "We know about that too," Salvo said. "The procurement irregularity. Medical supplies, who—" She stopped, processed. "That comes back to Ravenwood. The supply chain concern you flagged in 2021 touched a private medical logistics contractor. That contractor has since been acquired. Its current parent company has a hospital services division." Salvo paused. "Which manages procurement contracts for several Colorado facilities. Including Ravenwood." "Including Ravenwood." The room was very quiet. Elena said, "Marcus Vale." "Marcus Vale sits on the board of the parent company," Salvo said. "Has since 2020. The position is disclosed. It's in his public biography, but it's not something most people connect to the hospital's supply chain because the company name changed during acquisition and the board roster isn't prominently featured." She folded her hands on the table. "The The complaint you filed in 2021 would have, if investigated fully, surfaced the procurement irregularity. That irregularity, traced forward, connects to the parent company. The parent company connects to Vail. So he buried the complaint, Elena said. We believe someone buried it. Whether Vail specifically directed the performance review or whether someone acting on his behalf made that decision, we're still establishing. But the timing is, Salvo chose the word carefully, not coincidental. Elena sat with this. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. Not fast, just present, noticeable, like her body was flagging that the information she was processing was significant. And when he ran the background check on me 48 hours ago, she said, he was trying to find out what I knew, whether the dormant review had done what it was supposed to do, or whether your departure had been clean enough that you weren't a threat. Salvo nodded. The inquiry he ran would have shown him your current employment status, your lack of active military affiliation. He may have decided you were manageable, or he may have started building a case to remove you before you became less manageable. He built it fast, Elena said. The suspension was tonight. Yes, which suggests he found something in what he pulled that concerned him more than he expected. She thought about what Marcus might have found. Her certifications, her training record at Ravenwood, which was exceptional. The gap where her military record should have been detailed and wasn't, because her transition agreement had placed a partial seal on the specifics. To someone looking from the outside, that gap looked like absence. Marcus would have seen a woman with military service and no notable record in a sealed file, and he might have read the sealed file itself as the threat, not knowing what was inside it, only knowing it was locked. He was afraid of what he couldn't see, she said. Which is usually the thing that moves people fastest, Salvo agreed. Holt spoke for the first time from his corner. What do you need from her tonight? A formal statement on the supply chain complaint. Dates, specifics, anything she remembers. An authorization to unseal the relevant portions of her service record for use in the investigation. Salvo looked at Elena. We can move the investigation without your cooperation. It'll take longer and the outcome may be less complete. With your statement, we can close the loop on the 2021 filing and establish a clear line of motive. And the performance review? Elena said. The false one. Expunged from the record once the investigation concludes, formally and completely. Salvo held her gaze. We're not asking you to do this for us, Ms. Voss. We're asking you to do this for the record. Elena looked at the laptop screen, at the document that had sat in her file for 3 years, that she hadn't known existed, that had shaped the invisible shape of her departure without her ever having seen it. She thought about the transition agreement she'd signed too quickly, and the things she had not understood were still attached to her. She thought about Dana Reyes' face in the corridor and the 4 names in the formal complaint she hadn't been able to read fully yet. She thought about Denny Marsh, who had asked good questions in a 3-week intensive in 2018 and who was not coming home. Give me the authorization form, she said. She spent 90 minutes in that room. Salvo was thorough without being exhausting. She asked precise questions and listened to precise answers and did not push for elaboration where Elena had already been complete. Corrigan typed and occasionally asked her to repeat a date or a figure. Holt stayed. He didn't say much. At one point he brought her coffee from the hall machine, so bad coffee, the specific terrible coffee of hospital vending equipment, and set it by her elbow without comment. And she drank it because she needed it, and because it was, in its small way, the kind of thing people did for each other. She signed the authorization at 12:47 a.m. Salvo gathered the documents, checked something on her phone, and looked up. We're going to need you here tomorrow. Not at 7, earlier. There are some things developing that you should be present for. What kind of things? The kind that require you to have hospital access. Salvo paused. The suspension. That's going to be addressed. Addressed how? Officially. Through appropriate channels. By morning. She said it with the particular certainty of someone who had already set something in motion that Elena wasn't privy to yet. Elena looked at Holt. He gave her the small nod of a man confirming something he can't say directly. She left the consultation room at 12:53 a.m. and stood in the second-floor corridor alone for the first time since she'd answered Salvo's call. The hospital at this hour had the specific quality of an institution in its off-cycle, quieter but never actually quiet. The mechanical hum of equipment and the distant sounds of staff and the occasional intercom that made the silence feel thin. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, not for any tactical reason, just because she needed the motion. The stairwell was fluorescent and smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and she went down 2 floors with her hand on the rail and her mind running through everything she'd just learned, sorting it, resorting it, looking for the holes. The holes were in the timeline. The false performance review had been filed in October 2021. She had submitted her separation paperwork in November 2021. The timing assumed that whoever filed the review knew she was about to leave, or had decided to ensure she would, but she hadn't told anyone she was considering separation until late October. Her CO. One other person. She stopped on the landing between floors. One other person. She had told the supply chain concern to her CO, Colonel Dwight Aldrin, in August. She had filed the written concern in September. She had told one other person about the September filing. Not the content, just the fact of it, in a conversation that she had considered private. A senior medical officer she'd trusted. Someone who had been at Bragg longer than she had and knew the administrative landscape and whose advice she'd sought because she wasn't sure how her concern would be received. She moved through names in her head. She reached the ground floor and pushed through the stairwell door and nearly walked directly into Marcus Vale. He was in the main corridor, just outside the stairwell exit, and the collision almost happened. She stopped short, he stepped back, and for a fractional second they were close enough that she could see the exhaustion under his performance, the loosening at the edges of the authority he maintained like a second skin. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice had changed. Not much. He still had the register of someone who expected to be listened to. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there in the consultation room. "Dr. Vale," she said. She moved a step around him. "How is the patient?" She stopped, turned back. He was asking about Callum. The question was, she studied him, not tactical, not a performance for anyone because the corridor was empty and there was no audience. I was asking because he was a physician, and somewhere beneath everything else, the thing that had made him a physician still operated. "He made it through to the OR," she said. "Current status is stable critical." Vale nodded. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at the middle distance. "You made a correct call on the tension pneumo." "Yes." "I wouldn't have—" He stopped, started differently. "Summerfield is good, but he doesn't have experience with blast injury. That specific pattern." He paused. "You do." She watched him. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't recanting. He was doing something more complicated and less comfortable. He was acknowledging a competence he had spent the evening trying to erase, and he was doing it in an empty corridor at 1 in the morning where it cost him nothing politically, which made it, in its way, more honest than anything he'd said in public. "I know where I developed that experience," she said, "and I know it doesn't fit the profile you decided I had." He met her eyes. Something in his face moved. "No, it doesn't." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she said, "You ran a background check on me." He didn't deny it. That surprised her. "I was trying to understand why the file was sealed," he said. "Were you?" "I thought—" He pressed his mouth together. "I found the performance review, the one from 2021. It looked like I'd been pushed out," she said, which is what it was designed to look like. She watched him process this. "Someone put it there, Dr. Vale, someone who knew you would eventually look." His face changed. Not dramatically. He was too controlled for that. But the calculation in it shifted. The way calculations shift when a variable you've been treating as fixed turns out to be the thing moving everything else. "Who?" he said. "That," she said, "is what the investigation is going to establish." She stepped around him and walked toward the exit. This time, she didn't stop. She was in her car in the parking structure, engine running, heat on, her phone showing 1:09 a.m. when Holt texted her. Not the secure channel, her personal number. She'd given it to him somewhere in the last 3 hours. She couldn't precisely remember when. "Callum's out of OR. Surgeon says 6 to 8 weeks. Full function likely. He's asking who did the field stabilization." She typed, "Tell him it was the team." Holt. "He's not going to accept that." She. "Then tell him later. He needs to sleep." A pause. Then, "You should too. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She put the phone in her jacket pocket and sat for a moment with the heater running and the concrete of the parking structure pale and gray around her. She was tired in the specific way of people who have been running on controlled adrenaline for several hours. Not exhausted exactly, more like the landscape after a storm, everything very still and slightly strange. She thought about the name she'd started to come to on the landing between floors. The senior medical officer she'd told about the September filing. She had not reached the name yet, had stopped herself, which was its own kind of information. Some part of her was resisting it. That meant something. She drove home, showered, and slept for 4 hours without dreaming. When the alarm went off at 5:30, she was already mostly awake. She was back at Ravenwood by 6:15. The day shift was gone, and the overnight staff was winding down, and the hospital had that specific transitional energy of an institution in handoff. One group carrying the accumulated weight of the night, the other carrying the fresh alertness of morning, both operating simultaneously in a kind of managed overlap. Elena walked through the main entrance and past the security desk, and the nurse at the station who looked up, and then looked down, and then looked up again when she registered who it was. "Ms. Voss," the nurse said. Her name was Greta, and she'd been on the desk for as long as Elena had been at Ravenwood, and she said the name with the cautious register of someone who knew something Elena didn't. "Greta, Dr. Harmon is looking for you. She's in admin." Dr. Veda Harmon was Ravenwood's chief medical officer, the person above Marcus Vale in the institutional hierarchy, a position she occupied with the somewhat exhausted authority of someone who had been managing Marcus Vale's consequences for longer than she'd anticipated when she'd taken the job. Elena had interacted with her twice in 3 years. Both times, Harmon had struck her as sharp and under-resourced, and deeply aware of the gap between those two conditions. Elena went to admin. Harmon's office was the kind of office that looked organized but had the specific quality of organization that was actually managed chaos, piles that were meaningful to the person maintaining them and inscrutable to anyone else. Harmon herself was 61, tall, silver-haired, dressed in the clinical way of a physician who had never stopped thinking of themselves primarily as a physician despite 30 years of administrative drift. She was on the phone when Elena came in. She pointed at the chair across from her desk. Elena sat. Harmon finished the call in under a minute, put the phone down, and looked at Elena with the expression of someone who had been briefed and was still processing the full scope of what they'd been briefed about. "Ms. Voss," she said, "I spent an hour this morning being informed by a federal agent about things that have been happening in my hospital that I was not aware of." "I understand. I want to be clear that I find that both professionally and personally mortifying." She said it bluntly, without self-pity. "The suspension placed on you last night is rescinded as of this morning. You are reinstated with full access and pay continuity." She paused. "That's the administrative part. What's the other part?" Harmon looked at her for a moment. "Agent Salvo has requested that you be present this morning for a conversation with Dr. Vale, a formal one, in this building." She paused again. "Vale has been notified that a federal investigation has identified him as a subject of interest in a procurement fraud matter and a connected personnel misconduct matter. He's been asked to come in. He's here." Elena said nothing. "I want to ask you something," Harmon said, "and I want you to understand that you are not obligated to answer it, and your position here is not contingent on your answer." She folded her hands on the desk. "Last night, in the trauma bay, what you did for the patient, Callum, could any other nurse on our staff have done that?" Elena thought about how to answer honestly. "With the right training, yes. The specific procedural knowledge is teachable. It's not rare knowledge. It's just, in the right situation, you need someone who has used it under pressure before. Who knows the difference between the procedure going right and the procedure looking right?" She paused. "Some of our staff could have gotten there, not as fast." Harmon nodded slowly. "We've been doing something wrong, haven't we, in how we've evaluated people?" "It wasn't quite a question. I think there are some structural habits," Elena said carefully, "that prioritize visible authority over demonstrated skill, and I think that creates specific blind spots in high-pressure situations." "Yes." Harmon looked at the desk. "That is a restrained way to describe what has been happening." She looked up. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this institution." "The institution can do the thing it should have been doing," Elena said. That's the apology I'd prefer. Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and said, "Tell Agent Salvo that Ms. Voss is here." The conversation with Marcus Vale happened in the large conference room on the third floor, the one used for board meetings and credentialing committee sessions, with the long table and the wall of windows that let in the early morning light, in a way that made the room feel more exposed than its institutional furniture suggested. Salvo and Corrigan were there. Holt was not. He was with Callum, who had come out of sedation at 5 a.m. and was asking questions that Holt was apparently the right person to answer. Harmon sat at the head of the table. Elena sat to her right. Marcus Vale came in with a lawyer. That told her something. The lawyer was a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as counsel for Vale and then said almost nothing for the next 40 minutes, which told her something else. The lawyer was there to observe, not to manage, which meant Vale had not fully disclosed to her how much was already documented. Salvo opened with the procurement matter. She laid it out with the specific efficiency of someone who had been building a case for 6 weeks and knew exactly in what order to place the pieces for maximum clarity. The supply chain irregularity Elena had flagged in 2000. The contractor. The acquisition. Vale's board position. The financial trail, which Corrigan displayed on the room's wall screen in a series of clean, unambiguous charts that connected the irregular procurement logging to transactions that had benefited the parent company during the acquisition period. Vale's face went through several stages. Elena watched them. Controlled engagement, careful positioning, a moment of what might have been genuine surprise at the specificity of what Salvo had. And then, toward the end of the financial display, something that settled into a kind of flat acceptance, like a man recognizing terrain he already knew. The second matter, Salvo said, concerns the personnel record of Elena Voss. Vale looked at Elena for the first time since sitting down. Salvo placed a copy of the false performance review on the table in front of him. This document was filed in October 2021 using administrative access credentials that have been traced to an account with access to both the medical supply chain system and military personnel administrative channels. She let him look at it. "We would like you to tell us who filed it." Vale's lawyer leaned toward him and said something low. Vale shook his head slightly, the kind of head shake that ended a conversation rather than continuing it. He looked at the document. He looked at Elena. He said, "I didn't file that." "We're aware," Salvo said. "We're asking who did." A silence. Vale's hands were flat on the table. He was doing the calculation Elena had watched him begin last night in the corridor. The one where the variable he'd been treating as fixed was actually the thing moving everything else. She could see him arriving at the same place she'd started to arrive at, on the stairwell landing. "There is a name," he said slowly, "that you should look at." And before he could say it, the door opened. Dr. Aldrin Pask, Ravenwood's Director of Medical Education, and formerly, Elena now remembered with a cold, specific clarity, a senior medical officer at Fort Bragg from 2019 to 2022, walked into the room with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had not been informed this meeting was happening and had just walked into the worst possible version of a morning he'd thought was going to be routine. He saw Elena. He stopped. She looked at him, at the face she recognized from the conversation she'd had in 2021, the conversation she'd thought was private, the one where she'd mentioned the September filing to someone she'd trusted. And she felt the pieces fit with the quiet, terrible completeness of something that has always been true and is only now visible. "Dr. Pask," Salvo said, "please come in and close the door." He didn't move. "Dr. Pask," Salvo said again, differently. His eyes were still on Elena, and in them was the precise look of a man who had spent 3 years certain. The thing he'd done had stayed buried, watching it surface from the exact direction he'd been most afraid of. He closed the door. Part 4. Aldrin Pask was 63 years old and had spent 31 of those years building a career on the specific skill of appearing trustworthy. It was not entirely a performance. He was, in certain genuine ways, a capable administrator and a competent educator, and the people who had worked under him over the years would have described him as fair, if demanding, and occasionally warm in the way of men who had learned that selective warmth was an effective management tool. He had been at Ravenwood for 2 years, recruited from a consulting position he'd taken after leaving the Army, and his transition from military medical officer to civilian medical education director had been smooth enough that most people at the hospital had never thought to ask what, precisely, he'd been doing in the years between. Elena had not known he was at Ravenwood. She had not known because she had not looked. She had spent 3 years making herself small and doing the work, and not looking at the institutional landscape above her in the way she'd once scanned landscapes for threat. That had been, she understood now, its own kind of mistake. He sat down across from Salvo. He set his coffee on the table. His hands were steady. She gave him that. His hands were very steady. "Dr. Pask," Salvo said, "you're not here as a subject of this meeting. I want to be clear about that." A pause. Yet, he looked at Salvo, then at Elena, then at Vale, who was doing the specific thing of looking at the table in the way of a man who has decided the best current strategy is not to be readable. "What's happening?" Pask said. "We're discussing a procurement irregularity connected to Ravenwood's medical supply chain," Salvo said, "and a personnel document filed in October 2021 using administrative credentials from a dual-access system." She slid a copy of the false performance review across the table to him. The access log shows the credentials used were connected to an account that had both medical supply chain permissions and military personnel administrative access. She paused. "That's a narrow profile, Dr. Pask." He looked at the document. Something happened in his face that was very small and very fast, and that Elena caught because she had spent years learning to read people in conditions where reading them wrong had consequences. It was not surprise. It was the precise micro-expression of a man who already knows what he is looking at and is deciding how to respond to the fact of being shown it. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," he said. "We're not suggesting anything," Salvo said. "We're telling you that the access credentials trace to a profile that matches yours. We're giving you the opportunity to explain that before we go further." Vale's lawyer had gone very still. She was watching Pask with the attention of someone recalculating a situation she had misread on entry. Pask said, "I want my own counsel present." "That's your right," Salvo said. "We can pause and reconvene." She did not move. "But I'd like to ask one question before we do that. You were at Fort Bragg from 2019 to 2022. You were a senior medical officer in the administrative division. That's not classified." "No. And during that time, you were Elena Voss's senior point of contact for administrative matters regarding the advanced trauma training program she ran." Salvo looked at him. "In September 2021, Ms. Voss told you she had filed a written concern about a supply chain irregularity." Silence. "Did she tell you that?" Salvo said. Pask looked at Elena. It was a long look. Not calculating now, something past calculating. The look of a man arriving at the moment where the thing he's been carrying becomes too heavy to keep picking up. "Yes," he said. "She told me." The room was very quiet. "I'd like my counsel now," he said. Salvo nodded. Corrigan was already dialing. They broke for 40 minutes. Elena sat in Harmon's office and drank water and did not talk because Harmon seemed to understand that talking was not what was needed, and sat at her own desk doing paperwork with the respectful efficiency of someone giving another person space inside shared square footage. Elena appreciated it without saying so. She was thinking about 2021, about the specific exhaustion of that year, not physical exhaustion, which she knew how to manage, but the grinding kind that came from sustained emotional suppression in a high-stakes environment. She had been running 3 overlapping training cycles, managing her own caseload, and sitting with the knowledge of the supply chain concern like a stone she couldn't put down. When she'd told Pask about the September filing, she had been 31 years old and tired in a way she hadn't known how to name yet, and she had trusted him the way you trust someone who has been competent in your vicinity for long enough that competence starts to feel like character. She had been wrong. Not wrong about his competence, wrong about the character. She thought about what that wrongness had cost her. 3 years in a position below her skill level. A false document in her record. The work she could have been doing that she had not been doing because she had made herself invisible in a place that didn't deserve the fullness of what she carried. She thought about the 4 names in the formal complaint. The nurses Vale had pushed out. She didn't know their stories yet in full, but she knew the shape of them. The same shape as hers. Smaller in scale, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe larger in ways she didn't know yet. people who had been accurate and inconvenient and had therefore been made to disappear by a system that was better at protecting its comfortable arrangements than its vulnerable people. She was angry. It was a quiet anger, the kind that doesn't move through you loudly, but sits very still and very heavy in the center of things. She had been angry before, in conditions much more immediately dangerous than this conference room in a Denver hospital, and she knew how to let the anger be useful without letting it make decisions for her. Harmon looked up from her desk. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Elena said. Then, because it was more honest, "Not entirely, but I'm functional." Harmon nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something. She said, "When this is done, when all of this is formally concluded, I want to have a real conversation about this department, about how we've been running things and what needs to change." She paused. "I'd want your input, not as a courtesy, because you apparently see things I've been missing." "I'll have that conversation," Elena said. Harmon's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and looked at Elena. "They're ready." Pask's counsel had arrived. A different lawyer than Vale's, younger, a man who moved with the quick competency of someone used to being called into difficult rooms on short notice. He and Pask had spent their 40 minutes somewhere private, and whatever had been said in that time had produced a visible change in Pask's bearing. He sat down at the conference table looking like a man who had made a decision, not a comfortable one, but a decision. Vale was still there. His own lawyer had requested a break twice and been told twice that they were welcome to step out, but the meeting was continuing. They had stayed. Salvo reconvened with the specificity of someone who had spent the pause preparing the next stage. "Dr. Pask," she said, "your counsel has indicated you'd like to make a statement." "I would," Pask said. His voice was even. He had the controlled quality of a man delivering something he'd rehearsed in the last 40 minutes and was delivering exactly as rehearsed. "I accessed Elena Voss's personnel file in October 2021 using credentials I had legitimate access to through my administrative role. I authored the performance review document that appears in her file. I did this because..." He paused. One beat. "Because I was asked to." The room shifted. "By whom?" Salvo said. Pask looked at Vale. Vale's lawyer said, "My client." "It's already on record," Pask said. "The financial transfers are on record. Dr. Vale, I assume they have the financial transfers." Vale said nothing, but the color in his face had changed. "We have them," Salvo confirmed. Pask nodded, the nod of a man closing a door behind him. "Marcus contacted me in September 2021. We had a prior relationship through a medical conference circuit. We'd known each other for several years professionally. He told me that an internal concern had been flagged through military channels that connected to a contractor he had a financial relationship with. He asked me to manage the situation." He looked at his hands. He used that word. Manage. "And managing meant filing the false review," Salvo said. "It meant making Voss's departure look motivated, so that if her supply chain concern ever surfaced, she could be characterized as a disgruntled former employee with a documented performance history." He paused. "I understood what I was being asked to do." "And you did it anyway," Elena said. It was the first time she'd spoken in the conference room since Pask had walked in. Her voice was level. She wasn't asking him to justify it. She was just saying it precisely. He looked at her. "Yes." She held his gaze. She didn't look away, and she didn't perform anything. Not anger, not contempt, just the plain factual acknowledgement of what he'd said. He looked away first. Vale's lawyer leaned close to him and spoke in a voice too low to catch. Vale shook his head. A different head shake than last night. Not the one that ended conversations, but the one that preceded something unwilling. "The procurement irregularity," Vale said. His voice had the specific quality of a man beginning to negotiate terms. "The financial relationship with the contractor. I wanted on record that I did not personally direct the supply logging. I approved a distribution framework that was then..." "Dr. Vale," Salvo said, "we have 6 weeks of documentation. The financial trail, the board communications, the contractor correspondence. I'd strongly recommend that the next conversation you have is with your attorney, not with me." She paused. "But I can tell you that what we have establishes clear personal benefit from procurement decisions that were influenced by your board position, and a direct request to a military officer to falsify a personnel record in connection with suppressing a concern about those decisions. Vale went quiet. His lawyer said, "My client will not be making further statements at this time." "That's fine," Salvo said. She looked at Corrigan. "We're done here for now." She stood. The room began the specific reorganization of a formal meeting ending. Papers gathered, chairs pushed back, the lawyer for Vale touching his arm in the way of someone steering a client toward the nearest exit. Pask's counsel was already speaking in a low voice near the window. Harmon had not moved from her seat at the head of the table. Elena stood. She felt the anger still, steady, quiet, not going anywhere. But beneath it, something else had come up, something she hadn't fully expected. Relief. Not the relief of a problem solved, because the problem was far from solved, but the relief of a thing that had been invisible and wrong becoming visible and named. 3 years of a document sitting in her file that she hadn't known was there, shaping the invisible architecture of her diminishment, and now it was in this room, and everyone in this room knew what it was. That mattered. In ways she wouldn't fully understand until later, it mattered enormously. Holt was waiting in the corridor outside. He had his phone in his hand and the expression of someone who has just received information and hasn't decided how to characterize it yet. "Callum is asking for you," he said. "Not yet," she said. "He needs to be stable at least another—" "I know, I told him that. He asked me to pass along that he's aware of what you did and that he owes you." A pause. He said, and I'm quoting, "She's going to have to collect in person because I'm not getting on another helicopter." Something loosened in Elena's chest. Not a lot. Enough. "Tell him the debt is canceled," she said. "He doesn't owe me anything." "He won't accept that either." Holt put his phone away. "What happened in there?" She told him the shape of it. Not every detail, just the structure. Pask's statement. Vale's position. The financial documentation Salvo had laid out. He listened the way he listened to everything, with total attention and no visible reaction until she was done. "Pask will cooperate," he said. It wasn't a question. "His counsel is already negotiating. I think he's been waiting for someone to find him." She thought about it. Not waiting hoping, waiting dreading, but it's the same physiological state. Holt looked at her. "You're not surprised by any of this." "I'm surprised by some of it," she said. "The scale of it, how long it ran. But the pattern—" She shook her head. "The pattern is just what happens when people with authority decide that the most important thing to protect is their own position. It doesn't require unusual malice, just ordinary self-interest in a system that makes it easy." And Pask. Pask is more complicated. She thought about the face she'd read at the table, the thing that wasn't surprise. He knew what he did was wrong while he did it. That's different from Vale, who I think genuinely believes most of what he does is justified. She paused. "I'm not sure which one is worse." By noon, the formal situation had begun to move with the specific momentum of institutional processes that have been given sufficient evidence and sufficient authority to proceed. Salvo's office had been in contact with Ravenwood's board since early morning. The board had convened an emergency session at 10 a.m. At 11:35, Harmon had received a directive from the board chair placing Marcus Vale on immediate administrative leave pending the formal investigation. Vale had left the building at 11:42 through the main entrance with his lawyer and without his badge, and several members of the day shift staff had been in the lobby when he walked through, and the word had moved through the hospital with the speed that only hospital gossip moved, which was approximately the speed of something that needed no medium to travel through. Elena had not been in the lobby. She had been in the trauma bay reviewing the handoff notes on Gerald Marsh, who had, she was relieved to find, been imaged at 10 p.m. the previous night after presenting with a headache spike, confirmed a minor concussion, and was being monitored appropriately. Patel had caught it. She made a note to tell him. She was at the nursing station when Dana Reyes found her. Dana looked like someone who had not slept and had spent the morning deciding whether to have a conversation she'd been avoiding. She stopped at the station and stood with her hands at her sides and said, "I owe you an apology." Elena looked at her. "Not just for last night," Dana said. "For a while. I knew what he was doing, not the full scope of it, but enough. He moved people out, and I told myself it was just management style, that it wasn't my place." She stopped. "It was my place." I'm the charge nurse. It was absolutely my place. Elena said, You were protecting your position. Yes. That's human. It's not acceptable. No, Elena agreed. It's not, but it's human. She looked at Dana for a moment. The 4 nurses in the complaint. Do you know who filed it? Dana nodded slowly. Tomasz Wren. I was here before you. Marcus pushed him out 18 months ago. Tomasz kept everything. Every email, every documented conversation, every discrepancy in the performance reviews Marcus filed on him. She paused. He spent a year building the case before he found the right channel. Elena thought about Tomasz Wren, whom she didn't know and had never met, who had spent a year assembling documentation in whatever apartment or office he'd retreated to after Marcus Vail had shown him the door, who had done the quiet, unglamorous, necessary work of building something true out of something that had been designed to look the other way. I want his contact information, she said, when this is appropriate. Dana nodded. I'll get it. She started to leave. Then she stopped, turned back. The thing with the Bay 7 log, I did initial it. You were right. I know, Elena said. I was going to let it stand. I know that too. Dana looked at the floor briefly. I'm sorry. I heard you, Elena said. Not warmly, not coldly, just received. Dana nodded and walked away. What? The afternoon brought the peace Elena hadn't anticipated. She was in the small break room at 2:15, eating a sandwich she'd bought from the cafeteria and reviewing the authorization documents Salvo had asked her to formally complete, when Corrigan appeared in the doorway. Agent Salvo needs you, he said. Something came up. She followed him to the second-floor consultation room where they'd been the night before. Salvo was there with a new addition, a woman in a crisp navy blazer who introduced herself as Major Lena Okafor from the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. She was 40, direct, with the particular economy of movement of someone who spent her professional time in adversarial rooms. Ms. Voss, Okafor said, I want to be efficient because I have a flight at 7. The false performance review in your file is being formally expunged as of today. We have your authorization from last night and the corroborating statement from PASC, which is sufficient. Thank you. There's a second matter. Okafor opened a folder on the table. The supply chain concern you filed in September 2021. It was formally logged. It was then suppressed. We've established that. But the logging itself created a record that remained in the system. Because the concern was formally logged and then suppressed, rather than dismissed through proper process, it is technically an open concern. Elena looked at the folder. Meaning? Meaning the concern you filed 5 years ago is now the active originating document for the procurement fraud investigation. Your filing is the legal foundation of the case. Okafor held her gaze. Everything that follows, PASC's cooperation, the financial documentation, the case against Vail, traces back to a written concern you submitted in September 2021 that someone tried to bury. She paused. It didn't stay buried. Elena sat with that for a moment. 5 years. She had been 29 years old when she filed that concern, and she had filed it because the numbers were wrong, and wrong numbers in medical supply chains had consequences she'd seen in the field. Soldiers with inadequate equipment, logistical gaps in high-pressure situations, the specific cascading cost of a system that looked correct on paper and wasn't. She had filed it because it was the right thing to do, and because she was the person who had noticed. And therefore, in her understanding of things, the person who was responsible for saying so. She had done that. And then she had been separated from her career and had spent 3 years in a hospital where she was called ordinary by people who did not know what ordinary meant. And now the thing she'd filed was the thing bringing the wall down. There's something else in the folder, Salvo said. Okafor turned to the second page. As a result of the procurement fraud investigation and the connected personnel misconduct finding, the Army has initiated a review of all personnel actions associated with Dr. PASC's administrative tenure at Bragg from 2019 to 2022. She looked up. Initial review has identified 3 additional personnel files with documentation irregularities consistent with the pattern used in yours. We're notifying those individuals today. 3 more people. Elena absorbed this. 3 more people who had been carrying false records in their files and hadn't known. Do you need anything from me for those? She said. Your statement is already on record and will be used as the reference document for the pattern assessment. You don't need to do anything further for those cases. Okafor closed the folder. What we do need to discuss is your transition agreement. Elena had been waiting for this. The agreement you signed in November 2021 included provisions that remained active because your separation was processed as voluntary, Okafor said. Given the evidence that your separation was influenced by the suppression of your supply chain concern and the false performance review, both of which constitute misconduct by parties with administrative authority over your service, there is a legal basis for a formal review of the separation circumstances. What does that mean practically? It means, Okafor said, that if you choose to pursue it, the circumstances of your departure from the Army can be formally reclassified, the separation record corrected, the agreement reviewed for provisions that were signed under conditions that were not fully transparent. Elena thought about the transition office, the rainy Thursday, the 2 hours of stamping and signing, the staff officer who hadn't looked at her. She thought about what she had believed she was signing and what she had apparently signed. "I'll pursue it," she said. Okafor nodded. "We'll send the forms to your attorney of record, or to a new attorney if you prefer." "I'll get an attorney." "Good." Okafor closed her folder and stood. "One more thing, Ms. Voss." She paused. "The supply chain concern you filed in 2021, the one that's now the foundation of this case, the review board is going to cite it formally. There will be a record, a clear, visible, permanent record, that you filed a legitimate concern that was suppressed, and that you were right." She met Elena's eyes. "I wanted you to hear that directly, not in a document." Elena nodded. She trusted herself to nod and not to do anything else, and that was enough. Okafor left. Salvo gathered her materials. Corrigan closed his laptop. "That's most of it for today," Salvo said. "We'll need you again midweek for a follow-up statement. Things will be moving fast now." "How fast?" Elena said. "Vale's attorney is already in conversations with our office. PASC has a full cooperation agreement in negotiation. The board is convening formally on Thursday to address the hospital-side misconduct findings." She picked up her bag. Fast. Elena sat alone in the consultation room for a moment after they left. The afternoon light was coming through the small window. The angle of it at 2:30 in October, low and sideways, the specific light that made rooms look both warmer and more exposed than they actually were. She thought about the 4 nurses. She thought about Tomasz Wren with his year of careful documentation. She thought about Denny Marsh, who had asked good questions and wasn't coming home. She thought about Callum 2 floors up, stable and asking to pay debts. She thought about 3 years of small rooms and careful silences, and about the Malinois crossing the room toward her last night, as if he'd always known where she was. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not a Denver area code this time. She answered. "Ms. Voss?" A man's voice. Older, measured, the kind of voice that had spent decades being deliberately neutral. "My name is Raymond Colquhoun. I'm the chairman of Ravenwood's board of directors." She sat up slightly. "I'll be brief," he said. "We're meeting Thursday. In light of the investigation and the personnel actions being taken, the board is going to need to address several structural changes to the hospital's leadership. Dr. Harmon has indicated that she intends to propose a new position." He paused. "We wanted to make you aware before Thursday, to give you time to consider." "What position?" Elena said. "Director of Emergency Trauma Services," he said. "New division. It would involve restructuring the trauma program, staff development, protocol oversight." Another pause. "Effectively, building what we should have had." Elena said nothing for a moment. "I understand this is a significant amount of information to receive in a single day," Colquhoun said. "It is," she agreed. "Take the time you need. We'll speak Thursday regardless." A brief silence. "I also want to say, on behalf of the board, that what you did last night for Sergeant Callum, under the specific circumstances of that night." He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "We didn't see you, and we should have. That's a failure I take personally." Elena said, "It's a failure you can address." "Yes," he said. "We intend to." She ended the call, put the phone on the table, pressed both palms flat against the table surface, the same way she'd pressed them against her thighs last night when the fine tremor had come. The table was solid, real. She pressed until she could feel her own pulse against it. The door opened. Holt leaned in. He took in her posture, palms flat, straight-backed, the stillness she wore when something was being processed. And he said, "Bad news?" "No," she said. He looked at her. "Then why do you look like that?" She thought about how to answer. She said, "Because I spent 3 years making myself fit into a space that was this big." She held her thumb and forefinger 2 inches apart. "And now the space is—" She stopped. She didn't have a gesture for it. "I'm recalibrating." Holt came into the room and sat down across from her without being invited, the way people who have known you for less than 24 hours sometimes do when circumstances have compressed what would otherwise take years. He said, "Callum is awake and stable and driving his nursing team insane, which means he's going to be fine. Pask is cooperating. Vale is gone. Your record is being corrected." He paused. "What does recalibrating look like right now?" "Like sitting in this room for another 5 minutes," she said. He nodded. He sat with her in the room for 5 minutes. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she, which was, she thought, exactly right. When she stood up to leave, her phone buzzed again. Text message. Number she didn't recognize. 7 words. "We need to talk before Thursday's meeting." She turned the phone so Holt could see it. He read it. His face went through the recalibration she'd come to recognize. "Do you know that number?" "No," she said. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 10 seconds. "Tomasz Wren. I filed the complaint. And there's something in it you haven't seen yet. Something about you specifically that changes what Thursday looks like. Meet me tonight." Elena stared at the screen. She looked at Holt. He was already reading over her shoulder. She heard him exhale slowly through his nose, not alarmed but reassessing, which from him was nearly the same thing. She typed, "Where?" The response came immediately, with an address 2 miles from the hospital, and below it, one more line, "Come alone. What I have, if it gets out wrong, ends more than Vale's career. It ends yours too." Part 5. She didn't go alone. She had considered it for approximately 30 seconds, the specific 30 seconds in which she read Tomasz Wren's message twice, looked at the address, looked at the final line, and ran through the realistic range of what "come alone" meant, from a man who had spent a year building a case file and then filed it through official channels. It didn't have the shape of a threat. It had the shape of someone who was scared of collateral damage. Those were different things, and she knew how to read the difference. But she was also not 29 years old and running on idealism and the belief that doing the right thing was sufficient protection against the consequences of doing the right thing. She was 34 and she had learned in a series of expensive lessons that caution and courage were not opposites. She told Holt where she was going. She told him to wait in his car 1 block from the address, and to answer his phone on the first ring if she called. He started to argue. She said, "He's not a threat. He's a witness who's scared of the blast radius, but I'm not stupid." Holt looked at her for a long moment and then said, "First ring." And she said, "First ring." And they went separately. The address was a coffee shop that had closed at 6 p.m. and a walk-up apartment on the 2nd floor above it, accessed by an exterior staircase on the building's south side. Elena climbed the stairs at 4:47 p.m. with the October cold coming off the mountains in thin, sharp waves, her coat collar up, her hand steady. She knocked. The man who opened the door was 41, which she knew from the complaint documentation. He looked older. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone who'd been visibly broken, but in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that it had changed the set of his shoulders and the economy of how he moved. He was medium height, pale, with dark circles that were clearly chronic rather than tonight's production. And he was holding a mug of something that steamed and looked at her with the specific expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular moment for so long that when it arrives, they're not sure what to do with their face. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Mr. Wren." He stepped back and let her in. The apartment was small and extremely organized in the specific way of a person who had been living with a lot of paper and had developed systems for it. There was a table near the window with 2 chairs and a laptop and a series of folders arranged in a sequence that Elena recognized, from the brief glimpse she got before he shifted to block her view, as chronological. He had been working on something before she arrived. He sat across from her. wrapped both hands around the mug. I want to say something before I show you what I have, he said. All right. I filed the complaint because it was the right thing to do and because I'd watched Vale do this to 4 people, including me, and I knew it would keep happening until someone made it stop. He paused. I did not file it expecting it to go where it's gone in the last 24 hours. I didn't know about the military angle. I didn't know about you. You knew my name was in the complaint. I knew there was a nurse he'd targeted whose documentation was cleaner than anything I'd seen. Someone he clearly considered more dangerous than the rest of us. He turned the laptop toward her. I've been cross-referencing his personnel actions for 18 months. When I found your name attached to a suspension last night, someone on the overnight staff contacts me. They've been feeding me information from inside for 6 months. I did what I always do. I went looking. The laptop screen showed a document, not a medical record, not a personnel file, a financial record. A series of transactions from a corporate account Elena didn't immediately recognize, flagged and annotated in Ren's hand, connecting to a subsidiary company name, connecting to a second name, connecting to a hospital department. She read down the page, slowly, and found her name. Not in the financial transactions, in an email chain attached to the document, an internal communication from 20 May between 2 parties whose names she recognized, Marcus Vale and a procurement contractor. The email discussed the supply chain concern that had been flagged through military channels. It discussed the need to manage the situation. And then, in the specific language of men who believe they are being careful, it discussed the asset, that was the word they used, asset, that would need to be relocated before the concern could be traced back to the contractor relationship. The asset was her. He knew about the supply chain concern before Pask filed the false review, Elena said. He knew about it the same week you filed it, Ren said. He had a contact inside the administrative channel at Bragg, not Pask. Someone else, someone further up, who flagged incoming concerns that touched the contractor relationship. He paused. Pask was the instrument. Vale was the architect, from the beginning. She looked at the email chain, at the date stamps. She had filed the concern in September 2021. Vale had been informed in September 2021, within days. He had then contacted Pask, and they had constructed the false review and waited for her to leave. And when she'd left, Vale had moved into the next phase, the board position he'd accepted with the parent company in 2020. Formalized the financial relationship, and spent 4 years building a procurement arrangement that quietly moved money through a supply chain that, on paper, was serving military medical facilities and wasn't. People had consequences from that. Somewhere, in field deployments she would never have direct knowledge of, there had been gaps. Equipment not where the record said it was, medical supplies logged as distributed that weren't. She had sensed the gaps before she'd understood them. That was what she'd noticed in 2021. She had not known then how far it went. This is what Salvo doesn't have, she said. Not yet. He reached across the table and turned the laptop back toward himself. This email chain came from an internal source inside the parent company, someone who's been building their own case separately. They contacted me 2 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out the cleanest way to get it into official hands without... He stopped. Without it looking like you got it in a way that compromises admissibility, she said. Yes. She looked at him. Who's your source? A financial analyst at the parent company. She's been documenting the irregularities from inside for 8 months. She's prepared to cooperate formally. She was waiting for the right moment. He paused. I think tonight is the right moment. Elena took out her phone and called Salvo. Salvo picked up on the second ring, which told her Salvo had been waiting for her to call. She said, I have something, and I have a witness who is prepared to cooperate formally tonight if you can come to him. She gave the address. Salvo said she'd be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 14. Ultim. What followed was 3 hours of the specific focused work of transferring evidence into official hands correctly. Not the dramatic version of that process, not the cinematic shorthand, but the actual version, which involved careful chain of custody documentation and precise questions, and Ren's internal source joining the conversation by secure video call from a hotel room in Phoenix, where she had, it turned out, been staying for a week in anticipation of exactly this kind of contact. Her name was Daria Solano. She was 37, a forensic accountant by training, and she had found the irregularity in the parent company's books in her second month on the job and had spent the subsequent 7 months building a documented picture of it before reaching out to Ren through a mutual contact. She was not comfortable on camera. She kept glancing off screen in the way of someone very aware that they were doing something that could not be undone. But her documentation was meticulous, and her testimony was steady, and by the end of the 3 hours, Salvo had everything she needed to significantly expand the scope of what was already a substantial federal case. Elena sat at the edge of Ren's table and watched it happen. She had done her part early, provided the connecting context, given Salvo the timeline that tied the email chain to the events she'd already documented in her own statement. After that, she was mostly witness to a process that had, as of tonight, grown considerably larger than one false performance review or one hospital chief's misconduct. At one point, Ren looked at her across the table while Salvo was on a call in the other room and said, "How are you doing with all of this?" It was such a plainly human question, asked in such a plainly human way, that it caught her slightly off guard. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because he'd spent a year doing something difficult and lonely and necessary and deserved more than a reflex answer, "It's a lot. It's a lot to learn in 24 hours. Try 18 months, he said. There was no self-pity in it, just the flat acknowledgement of someone describing terrain. "Was it worth it?" she said. "The filing, the year of work, the everything." He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "Ask me Thursday," he said, "after the board meeting. I'll know better then." She nodded. "Ask me the same question." He almost smiled. "Deal." Thursday came with gray morning light and a temperature that had dropped overnight and the specific quality of a day that knew it was going to be significant and was not making it easy by being pleasant about it. Elena arrived at Ravenwood at 8 a.m. She had actually slept, 6.5 hours, which was more than she'd managed in months. And she had dressed deliberately, which was not something she usually thought about. She wore her own clothes, not scrubs, because today she was not coming in as a floor nurse. She was coming in as someone the board had called. The hospital felt different, not transformed. It was the same building with the same squeaky wheel on the same crash cart, and the same bad coffee from the same vending machine, and the same specific smell of institutional disinfectant that she had walked through every day for 3 years. But the people in it moved differently around her, not dramatically, just slightly. A different quality of eye contact, a different register in the brief greetings, the way the security desk nurse said Ms. Voss when she came through, something in the emphasis that hadn't been there before. She went to see Callum first. He was in a private room on the 4th floor, which she suspected had something to do with Holt's conversations with hospital administration rather than standard room assignment. He was sitting up, which was against what his surgical team had probably told him, with his left arm in a stabilizing brace and a tablet on the bed next to him that he appeared to have been using until he heard her come in. He was younger than she'd expected, 36 in the file, but he looked, not younger exactly, more like someone who had a young version of themselves still visible behind everything the years had put on top. He had the particular physical presence of someone whose body was a working instrument rather than an aesthetic project, and the particular alertness of someone whose body had recently been badly damaged and was now tracking everything around it with the heightened attention of a system that had learned not to take stability for granted. "You're sitting up," she said. "I can sit up," he said. "They told me not to lean forward. I'm not leaning." "That's a significant technical distinction." "I'm a technical person." He looked at her. "You're Voss." "I'm Voss." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned in her time with military personnel that there was a specific kind of silence that soldiers sometimes needed before they said something that mattered to them, and she waited through it. "Holt told me what happened that night," he said. "The full version." "There's not a dramatic version," she said. "The team responded well." "Don't do that," he said. Not harshly, just clearly. "I was a medic for 6 years before I went special operations. I know what attention pneumo-developing looks like from the inside. I know what it means when someone catches it in time." He paused. "Thank you." She looked at him. She had received gratitude before in various forms and registers, from various people, in circumstances ranging from routine to extreme, and she had learned that the right response was not deflection and not performance, but something simpler, presence, letting the gratitude land instead of bouncing it back. "You're welcome," she said. He nodded. Something settled in his face. "Denny Marsh," he said. "He trained under you." "For 3 weeks. In 2018. He talked about those 3 weeks a lot." He looked at the window. "He said you told the class that the most dangerous thing in trauma medicine was the assumption of sufficient information. That you act on what you have, but you never mistake what you have for everything." She remembered saying it. She had said it on the 3rd day of the intensive, after a training scenario where 2 students had made a correct call based on incomplete information and had then stopped updating their assessment when new information came in. "I remember," she said. "He applied that constantly," Callum said. "Every op, every call-out." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted you to know he carried it." She held that. She held it the way she'd learned to hold the things that were too large for immediate processing, not by pushing them away, not by letting them overwhelm the present moment, but by acknowledging the weight of them and continuing to stand. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She stayed for another 10 minutes. When she left, Kratos, who had apparently been cleared to remain on the 4th floor by some mechanism she hadn't fully investigated, was lying in the corridor outside Callum's room. He raised his head when she came out. She put her hand on him briefly, the same gesture as that first night, steady and recognizing, and walked toward the elevator. The board meeting was in the same 3rd-floor conference room where the confrontation with Vale and Pask had happened 2 days earlier. It had been arranged differently. The long table configured formally, the board members along one side, Harmon at one end, an empty chair across from the board that was. Elena understood when she arrived, for her. There were 12 board members. Raymond Colquhoun, whom she had not met in person, was at the center, 70, silver-haired, with the composed authority of someone who had spent decades in rooms where authority was exercised and had developed strong opinions about how it should and should not be used. He looked at her when she sat down with the direct attention of someone taking a genuine measure. Salvo was not in the room. This was not her proceeding. This was Ravenwood's proceeding, which was the point. Harmon opened it. She spoke for 8 minutes, clearly and without hedging, about the investigation's findings as they related to the hospital's operations, the procurement connection, the personnel misconduct, the pattern of staff targeting. She described, in specific terms, the staff members who had been affected. Tomasz Wren, whose complaint had initiated the investigation. 3 other former nurses whose files were being reviewed and whose departures were being reassessed. And Elena. She described what had happened on the night of October 14th, the suspension, the trauma bay, Callum, with the factual precision of someone who had assembled a complete account and was not softening any part of it. Then she said, "We failed Ms. Voss. We failed Mr. Wren. We failed the other staff members who were targeted. We failed our patients by tolerating a system in which a person's institutional status was more protected than their ethical accountability. I take responsibility for that failure as the chief medical officer of this institution, and I want it on record that I take that responsibility not as a formality, but as a genuine assessment of where my oversight was insufficient." The room was quiet. Colquhoun said, "Ms. Voss, I'd like to give you the opportunity to say anything you want to say to this board before we move to the formal actions." She had thought about this. She had not prepared a speech, because she didn't do speeches, but she had thought about what she actually wanted to say versus what would be expected or performative, and she had found that the two were different and that the real thing was simpler. 3 years ago, I came to this hospital wanting to do the work, she said. Not the title, not the recognition, just the work, in a place where the work was needed. I accepted being invisible because being invisible seemed like the safest way to do that. She paused. I was wrong. Not because invisibility doesn't work, sometimes it does, but because the people around me paid a cost for the system that my invisibility was accommodating. I should have pushed earlier. I should have been less patient with things that deserved less patience. She looked at the board. I want to be useful here. I want to build something that actually works for the people doing the hardest jobs in this building. If you offer me that role, I'll take it, but I'm not going to be quiet about what's wrong, and I'm not going to defer to seniority over evidence, and if that's a problem, it's not a problem, Colquhoun said. The board voted. It was not unanimous. 2 members abstained on procedural grounds related to the pending federal investigation. But the motion passed. The new division. The position. The mandate to restructure Ravenwood's trauma program from the floor up. Director of Emergency Trauma Services. She sat with the title for a moment after the vote. It didn't feel the way she'd imagined titles felt, in the abstract. It felt like a set of problems she was now responsible for solving, which was, she understood, exactly right. The formal consequences for Marcus Vail were announced publicly 6 weeks later, after the federal investigation had completed its initial phase. His medical license was suspended pending a full Board of Medicine review, a process that, based on the evidence submitted, his attorney had not contested with any meaningful argument. He resigned from the parent company's board in advance of a formal removal vote. The civil liability from the procurement fraud was, his legal team made clear through channels, going to be settled rather than contested, which told everyone who needed to know everything about the strength of the evidence. He did not return to Ravenwood. He did not return to medicine. He was, in the specific way of men who have built their entire sense of self on institutional authority, lost in a way that no external punishment had to inflict on him. The institution had already done it by no longer needing him. Pask received a negotiated outcome: full cooperation credit, formal censure, and a permanent bar from military administrative positions. He lost his role at Ravenwood immediately. Whether he found his way to something useful after that, Elena didn't know and didn't track. She had enough to track that was right in front of her. Tomasz Wren was offered a position at Ravenwood by Harmon, directly and in writing. He took 2 weeks to respond. When he did, he said yes, with conditions. He wanted to be involved in the new staff advocacy protocols Elena was developing, and he wanted those protocols to have actual teeth, rather than being the kind of document that existed to demonstrate institutional intention without producing institutional change. Elena said that was exactly what she wanted too. He started in January. Daria Solano testified before a federal grand jury in November. She was placed on paid administrative leave by the parent company the same day, which her attorney described as a lawsuit in formation, and which did ultimately become one. The last Elena heard, it had settled favorably. The 3 additional personnel files that Okafor's office had identified, the other people who had been carrying false records they didn't know about, received formal corrections through the Army review process. Elena did not know all of their stories. She knew one of them had left the military specifically because of the false records' downstream effect on a security clearance application, and she carried that knowledge the way she carried most of the things that were too large for comfort, not by resolving it into something clean, but by letting the weight of it inform what she did next. Callum was discharged on the 31st day. He came to Ravenwood's lobby on a Thursday afternoon in November to sign his final paperwork, walking under his own power, the left arm still in a partial brace, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told his full function would return and was not entirely willing to believe it until it did. Holt was with him. Kratos was not. Kratos was back on active assignment, which was right, which was what Kratos was built for. Elena met them in the lobby because she happened to be coming back from the administrative wing, and it was, she would later think, exactly the right kind of coincidence. Not arranged, not staged, just the ordinary accident of timing that sometimes puts people in the same place at the same moment. Callum saw her and stopped. Then he walked to her and extended his right hand. She shook it. He said, "You ever need anything?" He said it with the economy of someone for whom the words were a binding statement rather than social currency. "You call." "I know where to reach Holt," she said. "Don't go through Holt, here." He held out a card, but plain military contact format. Direct. She took it. He nodded once. She nodded once. He went back to his paperwork, and she went back to her day. And that was how that ended, which was to say it didn't end, it just took its permanent shape. 6 months after the night. The ambulance bay doors opened. Elena stood at the front of Ravenwood's new trauma simulation lab, a room that hadn't existed before January, that she had partially designed herself in collaboration with Bex, who had been promoted to lead simulation educator, and Dr. Patel, who had turned out to be exactly the kind of physician who gets better when given better structure to work within. There were 14 people in this room, a mix of nurses, residents, and 2 attendings who had specifically requested to attend the Advanced Blast Injury module. They were ranged in the loose semicircle that simulation training used, each with their own assessment materials, each at varying levels of preparedness for what she was about to ask them to do. She looked at them for a moment before she started, not sizing them up, assessing them the way she assessed everything, with the clear-eyed specificity of someone who needed accurate information to do what she was here to do. They were not uniformly talented. Several were nervous. One of the attendings had the specific bearing of someone who was here to confirm their existing competence rather than expand it, which was a mindset she was going to have to work on without embarrassing him in front of the room. The nurse nearest the door was holding her assessment materials with both hands in the way of someone who needed the anchor. Elena had been all of them, in one room or another, at one point or another. She said, "The most dangerous assumption in trauma care is that what you can see is everything that's happening." She had said this before, in another room, years ago, to a group that had included a young captain who had asked good questions. She said it again because it was still true, and because the people in this room needed it. We're going to spend today learning to work with incomplete information and remain open to revision. We're going to make decisions, and some of those decisions will be wrong, and we're going to learn from the wrong ones rather than pretending they didn't happen. She paused. Nobody in this room needs to already know everything. That's not why you're here. You're here because you're willing to do the work of knowing more. She looked at the nurse near the door, the one with both hands on her materials. The woman met her eyes. Elena gave her the small, specific nod of one person to another that meant, "I see you, and I'm not going to let you fail in here." The woman's grip on the materials loosened slightly. Elena turned to the simulation station and said, "Let's start." There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It accumulates in the way of water that finds the available paths, not by force, but by persistence, by the refusal to stop moving toward what it's moving toward, even when the direct route is closed. People who have this kind of strength are frequently underestimated because they don't perform. They function. They do the work without the theater. They absorb the costs without the accounting. They keep showing up in spaces that don't always deserve them, doing things those spaces couldn't do without them, waiting with a patience that the impatient mistake for passivity. Elena Voss had been underestimated for the last 3 years of her life by people who confuse the absence of noise with the absence of substance. She had allowed it, in part, because she had believed, incorrectly, that the safest way to exist in a damaged system was to accommodate the damage. She had been wrong about that. The safer thing, the harder thing, the thing that actually protects the people around you, is to refuse to make yourself smaller than you are. Not loudly, not combatively, just accurately. To take up the space that your actual capability warrants. To say, when someone tells you that you don't belong, I did my job, nothing more, and mean it with everything you have. She had been the person the military had been searching for. She had been the person the hospital had failed to see. She had been, all along, exactly what the situation required. And the situation had eventually, at significant cost to several people in one institution, been forced to reckon with that fact. The reckoning was not clean. It was never clean. Vale was gone, but the gap he'd left in 4 nurses' careers was not filled by his absence. Pask had cooperated, but the 3 years of a false document in Elena's record were not returned to her. Denny Marsh was not coming back. The cost of accommodation was always paid by someone, and the payment was never voided, only acknowledged. She knew that. She carried it. She did not pretend the resolution had made everything even, because resolutions don't work that way, and anyone who tells you they do is selling a simpler story than the truth. What she had was this: a room full of people who were willing to learn. A position built on something real. A record that now said, clearly and permanently, and for anyone who needed to see it, what she had actually done and who she had actually been. A dog who had crossed a trauma bay at midnight and sat at her feet as if he'd always known where she was. And the work, always the work, which was never finished and never supposed to be, which was the point. She had not come back to medicine because medicine had been kind to her. She had come back because people needed the thing she could do, and she was the person who could do it. And in the end, that had always been reason enough. It still was.